Welcome to Agape Circle for April of 2020. Our lesson this month is Lesson 8. Listen for the twofold purpose of this lesson, which the author gives us. And number one is to recognize the importance of a trustworthy judicial system, and also to recognize the necessity of basic honesty for the stability of the community. Now, she talks about how originally it was basically about the judicial system, but how as time went on and community continued to live together, that there was also a recognition that it was very important to hold the community together. One of the quotes that she gives is something I want to share directly with you because I think that gets at the heart of the whole thing. When she talks about this word, she says, the wound at the heart of this word is the betrayal and erosion of personal and institutional trust. Now, that's a direct quote from Eugenia Gamble. Now, before we go any further, I want to take a look at the two primary scriptures where this word is given. When Eugenia Gamble says that this word is primarily a word that was originally designed as a part of the judicial system, it reminded me of my fascination as a young boy and a young man with Perry Mason. Used to watch every episode I could over and over again. And now I think about the phrase that was always used in the courtroom, probably still is today. Fortunately for me, I haven't had the requirement of being in a courtroom anytime recently. The question that was always asked of someone before they were seated as a witness is that, do you promise to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Well, there's four parts to that. And very briefly, I want to just look at each one of those. It's pretty obvious to say what the truth is. That is, don't make up something that's not true when you are asked to tell the truth. But then the next part ask if you are going to tell the whole truth. That is, if you are not going to withhold anything. And we'll go into that in just a few minutes because I've got a couple of personal stories about that in my life. And then the third part is that you will say nothing but the truth. That is, you will not add to or embellish or improve upon the truth in any way in order to make it advantageous to you or to those whom you represent. And finally, the third part, so help you God. Now, when I was young and I heard that, I always thought that was sort of a threat of sorts to say, well, you know, if you don't tell the truth, God is going to get you for that. Well, you know what I found out through the course of my life is that I get myself through that. God doesn't have to get me because I suffer the consequences when I do not tell the truth. There are many consequences to not telling the truth. One of them is that you have to remember so much when you start telling lies, because you have to be able to string all those together in the future. I forget who it was that said, if you tell the truth, you got a lot less to remember because you're telling exactly what you know and exactly what happened. Well, I want to tell you a couple of stories today about two smiling boys. Let me go back and see if I can find an image of the first smiling boy before I tell you his story. This first smiling boy grew up with an older brother who had a nickname, Sport. And this boy was nicknamed Smiley by his father. That's what his father called him. Now, forgive me if you've heard this story before, because I may have used it on other occasions, but I think it's very appropriate for this study of what it means to tell the truth. This smiling boy was in the 6th grade at the time the story that I'm going to tell you happened, and he was in science class. And the teacher apparently was rather nervous about the topic that she had to teach about that day. And the story and the topic that she was going to talk about was the sexuality of earthworms. Now you can imagine with a class full of adolescents that any talk about sexuality perhaps was a little uncomfortable, and perhaps one that she wanted to make sure she had charge of the classroom. And so before she began the lesson, she made an announcement. She said, "There will be no laughing during this class." So she began to teach and began to explain, as the boy recalled, that earthworms are asexual. And as she turned around to write something on the chalkboard, someone in the class laughed out loud. And she whipped back around from the chalkboard and looked at the class, and she stared straight at this young boy. And he had this big, huge smile on his face, like he did most of the time. And she pointed to him and she said, "Young man, out in the hall right now." And so he did. He got up and walked out into the hallway. And shortly after he walked out into the hallway, she followed with a paddle in her hand and told him to turn around and put his hands on the wall, because she was going to paddle him for laughing in the class when he was instructed not to. Well, the adolescent boy knew that he was not the one who laughed, that he just happened to have that smile on his face, which got him in trouble in more than one circumstance. And he made the mistake of taking the paddle away from the teacher. Yeah, that's not something you really want to do. It's not something you really want to do, especially when your father is the superintendent of schools. The teacher gave in and let the boy return to the classroom. But before he got home that afternoon, his father, the superintendent of schools, had already heard her side of the story. And the boy never got a chance to tell his side of the story. And from that day forward, he wished that he had taken the paddling from the teacher, because it was far less severe, surely, than what he got at home. That's the story of the truth not winning out. And now let me tell you the story of the second smiling boy. But first, let me see if I can find a picture of that smiling boy for you. Yes, that's the second smiling boy. The second smiling boy was the third of 3 children in the family. He had 2 older sisters. And when he was very young, about 3.5 years old, one afternoon, his parents left him at home with his 2 sisters for about 10 minutes to both go to town together and do something they had to do. I don't know if anyone remembers exactly what they were going to town for, but they lived in a nice neighborhood and had neighbors all around them that were home in the afternoon, and so the parents felt relatively comfortable going to town in the small town where they lived for about 10 minutes, and gave strict instructions for all 3 children to stay inside and for the youngest to obey the older 2, who were 10 and 7 at the time, as I recall. So the parents left, and about 10 minutes later they came back. And when they drove up to the house, there was a police car out front. Now you can imagine that created quite a bit of anxiety for the parents, and so they jumped out and ran to the door, and there was a policeman talking to the 3 children. The children went back inside, and the policeman explained that someone in the house had called 911 and that he was there to investigate what was happening because they had hung up and had not indicated what was going on. Well, the policeman had already given the children a lecture about the dangers of calling 911 when there's really no emergency. And so the policeman left and went home, and the parents went inside and asked the children about who had called 911. And the boy, the one who always had a smile on his face, had a big grin on his face. And so the parents assumed that it was the 3.5-year-old who called 911. And they explained to him why that was something that he should not have done. And life went on. Well, the story picks up about 20 years later, when the family is all gathered for some holiday or event, when everyone is back together again, even though the children are mostly grown and living on their own or off at college, and everyone was back together again. And one of the older sisters just brought up out of the blue during a conversation when everyone was sitting around having a good time. She said, "Do you remember that time that you called 911 when you were young?" And of course the parents remembered very well, and I'm not sure that the boy did, but his older sister said, "Well, it wasn't really you. I was the one who called 911. So there, the whole truth comes out, and nothing but the truth. I want to come back to the fourth part of that courtroom question for swearing in of witnesses, because over the course of my life, I have realized that that whole part of "so help you God" turns out to be something that is a positive thing rather than a threat, because I have realized that it is, in fact, the very self of God who aids us in being able to tell the truth. And part of that is because it is in our knowing and being known by God and being loved for who we are and being forgiven for who we're not or who we have not yet become that gives us the courage to tell the truth in our lives. I just wanted to bring that up and give you something to think about in terms of how it is that God helps us in our ability to tell the truth, especially when it becomes critical in our lives. Now let's take a look at the New Testament passage that is included with the lesson from the 12th chapter of the Gospel according to Matthew. In the 12th chapter of Matthew, the Pharisees have already been complaining about Jesus plucking grain on the Sabbath because he and the disciples were hungry, and about him healing a man with a withered hand on the Sabbath. They are more interested in keeping the letter of the law and not really understanding what the heart of the law is. He has also been accused of being a demon because he has cast out demons. And then in this last section, just before the part that I read, he talks about bearing fruit and being fruitful, as well as recognizing where your treasure is and tying in the heart and speech. So, what we say, Jesus says, and how we say it, and what we don't say defines who we are, not just for now, but for all eternity. Scripture is rife with stories of those who choose to live God's truth rather than to speak what empire has declared as truth du jour. There are Shiphrah and Puah, the two midwives who refuse Pharaoh's instructions to kill all of the Hebrew baby boys and make up a story about the Hebrew women being strong and giving birth before they get there. There's the story of Rahab the prostitute who protects the two spies who come to Jericho to check out the promised land sent by Joshua. Scripture contains lengthy reports of those who are practiced deceivers, some of whom find their way to redemption and some of whom don't. There's Jacob, who deceives his father into giving him the blessing of the firstborn with the aid of his mother Rebekah and some smelly hunting clothes and some hairy animal skin on his arms. There is Ananias and Sapphira in the 5th chapter of Acts who deceive the community with their gifts and don't fare so well. And then there is Peter, of course, who is the one who is credited with denying Jesus 3 times. In the 26th chapter of Matthew, the story from verse 69 to 75 tells us about what happened on the night of Jesus' arrest when Peter follows those who arrested Jesus back to the courtyard outside Pilate's headquarters. Just a piece here I will leave you with to think about Peter's voice based on that story from Matthew. Here's how I imagine what Peter would feel in the midst of all of that. I followed them. No, it was not with courage, but I followed. It felt more like I was following with desperation, but I followed. It seemed like minutes before, bold words were coming out of my mouth, coming from a place I didn't even know existed, when I said, though all become deserters because of you, I will never desert you. And with love in his eyes, an anchor on his heart, and peace in his voice, he told me I would deny even knowing him. Not once, not twice, but 3 times, all before a cock could crow. Then 4 voices spoke, words of accusation, words of association. First a servant girl, then another servant girl, then a bystander, and finally the rooster sang his taunting wake-up call. That's when my cheeks became the canyon down which flowed a hot river, its bitter water carrying what felt like more than salt. I thought the bitter flow was my soul washing out to sea. You can imagine that Peter felt very much like a betrayer, and yet he is the one who is forgiven. He is the one that in the Gospel of John, Jesus tells to feed my sheep when he comes back to the disciples on the beach. Indeed, our words can convict us, but thank God that it is grace that delivers us. Stay well. We'll be in touch, and remember that you can too. Now here is our closing prayer.